Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
For those who can see, nothing is profane. So that we've tried to say, well, all of space is sacred in a way, and that there really isn't any space that is profane.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Reverend Rob Seidner, who is pastor of St. Charles Church in Lima, Ohio. Father Bacik and Father Seidner will discuss worship and space. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Rob, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be on this program with me. I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the question of liturgy and to slant it in the direction of space. Now, that might sound a little abstract to begin with, but I think we ought to be able to make it more concrete. Space is an important thing to us. People say today, I got to have my space, meaning they need their area, I suppose, to operate and to function. They got to give me my room and so on. And really, throughout the history of religions and so on, space has been important to people. They've needed their sacred spaces, their places where they could go and be with their God and so on. So we're going to talk, that's the general topic I'd like to introduce, sure. Liturgy and space. You game for that?
Sure I am.
Rob, great. I know you've done a lot of work with liturgy and so on. You've probably investigated this topic. Why don't you just tell me a little bit about the studies you've done in the area of liturgy?
Good. Thanks. I did a master's degree at Notre Dame about 10 years ago now during 4 summers. And liturgy and the space of liturgy has been a real interest of mine ever since. I've been involved in our diocese on our Art and Architecture Committee, in fact, headed it for a number of years. So it's a very interesting topic to me, the places that we use for our worship and how they ought to function for us and what kind of spaces they ought to be.
I think I picked the right person for this topic, Rob. I'm glad that we're able to discuss this. So I'd like to talk a bit about space in general, the way it was seen in primitive religions and so on. Talk a little bit about how people tried to carve out their sacred space. You know, I think about, and there's a book by Eliade called The Sacred and the Profane, and he's got a chapter in there on the question of space and ritual and liturgy and so on. And he talks about an Australian tribe, a nomadic tribe. They used to walk around, and the important part of their whole thing was this pole that they had. They had a sacred pole, and that pole was given to them by one of the gods when the gods came on the earth, and he cut it out of a certain kind of tree and left it with the tribe. And that pole that they had would sort of bend in various directions. It must have been a bit flexible, and that's where the direction the tribe would go in as they wandered about and lived out their nomadic existence. But when they got to a place, what they did is they put the pole down in a certain place, and that then was the center of the world for them. Yes. It all revolved around that place. And there were 2 researchers that studied the tribe that said there was one time when the pole got destroyed or lost, and when that happened, the tribe went into complete chaos and just laid down and were sort of ready to die because they had lost their place, their sacred place, the center of the world for them. Now that might suggest some ideas to you about this whole topic of liturgy and space and so on.
Well, I'm thinking how we speak today still of a reality that I'm not sure it actually exists, what we call the axis of the world. Mm-hmm. This sense of how we are rooted even as an entire globe within the solar system, that we have within space we are as a whole universe or as a globe rooted, and how key that is.
And it seems to be a psychological factor, doesn't it? That we have to have our space ordered in a way. I think that's a lot of the ways the primitive religions thought about space again, was in terms of the ordered world versus chaos.
Yes.
And they needed to create the ordered world, and then outside of that things were just falling apart. They had no coherence. You couldn't trust them and so on. The chaotic world was something that you had to avoid. To be cast out into chaos was to lose yourself, to be destroyed, to be disintegrated in one way or another. So they had to have their sacred space. And I find it interesting that even a nomadic tribe had to have that. But when they study other cultures, they find that didn't move around, then they would build their temples, for example, and they would have their special spots where they would go to be able to celebrate their liturgies and so on.
I'm thinking of, just to carry on with the nomadic idea, the Jewish people that so root our own Christian tradition carried the Ark of the Covenant with them throughout their wanderings in the desert for generations and generations.
And then when they lost the Ark, then it was, they were in a chaotic situation. It was important to find it and to get it back.
Yes.
That's a good analogy. In fact, to think about the Jewish people is to see space probably in a different direction, because a lot of our Jewish friends think that we Christians do not really understand their sense of space. They got that impression when we, maybe in terms of the state of Israel, when we didn't understand some of their wars in their mind at least, that the space is sacred to them. They have to have their place there, and that is what roots them, and they see it as the gift from God to them, and they have to take care of it, and they have to do that well, and in that sense they become sort of a light to the nations. Yes. They have a high moral calling that way, and that's part of their own sense of things. So space is actually crucial to them, the geography, the being in this place.
The idea of the land.
That's right.
Very important for the Jewish people, and the temple simply roots that all the more as the space within the space of the entire homeland.
That's right.
Yes.
And then I was thinking of, can we explore that further and talk about the temple? And the temple had its profane area too, the area outside.
The forecourt, I guess that was called.
That's right. And then there was the more sacred area. So even that distinction is important here between profane and sacred. You notice that's the title of Eliade's book, The Sacred and the Profane. Now, yes. A lot of our own efforts theologically these days is to undercut that distinction. Teilhard de Chardin made the famous statement that for those who can see, nothing is profane.
Yes.
So that we've tried to say, well, all of space is sacred in a way, and that there really isn't any space that is profane. Now, the primitive people didn't see it that way. They saw this distinction, and I think the Jewish people saw that as well, at least when they were looking at the way the temple was constructed and so on. We might explore that a bit.
I'd like to explore it because I think the Jews, in fact, made a bit of a very important move. They began to break down that distinction, or a very hard distinction between the sacred and the profane. They had a very strong sense of the place of God among them, but they were convinced that God was very close to them, was living among them. The carrying of the ark with them all the time was a sign of that. Their temple was indeed a house of God, but as you said, not just that. It was already a place that the people gathered. It wasn't a place simply for the statue of the god or the image of the god or whatever, but it was a place for them. They didn't enter into the holiest part of it, or at least not all of them, representatives did, but the forecourt and all the other areas around the temple were very important to the people. They were a gathering place for them. That's new in pagan experience, or that's new in primitive and religious experience with the Jewish people.
So you're putting the emphasis on the people who gathered there?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a real change from pagan experience to the Jewish experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see that still with the synagogue of the Jews, that the gathering place for the Jewish people, now that the temple no longer exists, they still gather regularly, weekly, and that's a very important place for them. It's their place of gathering to celebrate their faith and to be nourished in their faith and to hold themselves together as a people, too.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting phrase you use there, too, to hold themselves together as a people. That gets back to the way the space functions, that it helps form a community and brings us out of chaos. I'm trying to think of sort of secular analogs to this, or the way, is this just something that primitive people do, or do we have our own sense of space today? I began by saying that people say, I want my space, but that's really a psychological term, really. It's to say, I have to get away and don't invade my space, let me think my own thoughts, give me solitude, and so on. I suppose our houses function this way for us, right?
A whole house for an individual family, often too sadly, but with its fences and or its shrubbery that delineates it, or just the sense of property that is there that gives a sense of ownership and of being rooted. But then within the house, I'm thinking how important different spaces are to individual members, like each one's own bedroom. That's a great movement in any person's life when they begin to have their own bedroom. They have their own place.
And I was thinking that chaos return, because there's a lot of mothers who look in their teenage daughter's bedroom and say, there is chaos. You know? I mean, how can they live in there? How can they function? There's no community. I mean, there's no sense of order in all of this. So, but we all had, some other people say, well, that's my clutter. I feel at home here in all of this.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. So, yeah, we have our rooms in the house that are specialized. So I think some people find they can relax in certain chairs. Yeah. And I often advise people if they're going to meditate regularly to try to go to the same place to do the meditation.
Yes.
Because there seems to be a prayerful sense that can come over one just being in there. Because, you know, I was thinking one of the things we bring to space then is memory. Mm-hmm. You think of people who don't want their homes sold. You know, you think of the youngsters growing up and they get a certain age and their parents are older and maybe they're saying, well, I'm going to move, sell the house and get an apartment. And sometimes the young people say, well, I don't want that to happen. This is the house I grew up in. I want to be able to go there and to be part of all of that. I remember going to my house where I grew up one time and being just totally taken back by how small it was. And I had thought of it as much larger, and all the rooms and everything. The family was really nice, let me go through the house and everything. But it was very interesting to me, my reactions. I mean, it was important for me to see it. There was a sense of nostalgia about it, I suppose, and rootedness. And this was my place. But I was taken by how small everything seemed and confined compared to the way I had viewed it before.
Once you had moved out into the world more.
Yeah.
Your own world had gotten larger.
Expanded, that's right. Yes. That's right. Well, Rob, let's start to think of all of this talk of space in terms of our liturgy and maybe our churches, to apply this to the Christian context and setting. Do you want to, is there any directions that suggest it to yourself?
I think of something right off. I think that there's been a profound change that has been a difficult one, in fact, for the Roman Church in the last 20 years or so, since the Second Vatican Council, because we have moved off in a renewed understanding of ourselves as a church, where we see ourselves in much more community mode over against what was so strongly in our earlier experience an institutional and hieratic mode. And that's beginning to change how we think about the spaces in which we're gathering. We thought, in fact, quite like pagan people of millennia ago, that the church was the house of God. That's, in fact, a very pagan idea. Mm-hmm. And we've returned to what is a very early Christian idea, that the place that we call the sacred space of the church is, in fact, the house of God's people, akin to the Jewish experience. Of the synagogue. We're much, much closer to the Jewish experience than to pagan experience. But it's been a return that we're recovering it now.
Well, I like that, and I think that's an important idea. We would need a larger context to look at that in terms of the sacred and the profane. I guess if it's really true that all space has a sacredness about it, that God can be found out in the woods or walking the streets of our large urban areas, and all space is sacred in that sense, or sacramental, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what is this space that we call the church then? And maybe I would take a step. It's that place where the people gather to make explicit what they see happening in all the rest of their spaces. So it's not like the marketplace is profane and the church is sacred. the whole of the world is sacred, but the church is the place where we come to gather to talk about that, to remind ourselves of it, to be in touch with it. And I would say also add that it's gathering in that church area is meant to send us back to the marketplace, the home, the factory, the office, in order to somehow humanize that, to make everyone there a little bit more aware of the way the Spirit is at work in that sacred place.
Exactly. Without the liturgical experience, without the gathering of the community in this particular special place, we can lose a sense of what the truth is, that all space and all experience can be holy, is meant to be holy.
You know, I was thinking too, Rob, how psychologically that seems to be important to us, to have the special place. Not to distinguish sacred and profane, but special, or the explicitly religious space. We need that kind of things. We're not people who just live on a level. I mean, we need our special moments, and I think we need our special places. It's good to have some place to go like that. I'm thinking of Abraham Maslow, the psychotherapist, who used to visit the ocean once a year. He went there to renew what he called a plateau experience, an important experience to him, and he would always go there. He needed to do that, to be in this place, because it was nourishing to him, it calmed him down, helped him to remember who he was and what he was about and all of that. So that would be an example of us needing that. And it'd be interesting in the modern world to see how many people feel that need. Now, I know some people, like on our campus, we have a tiny chapel that's open 24 hours a day. It's a beautiful little chapel, and it's got a nice loft and so on. And people will be in and out of there all the time, and at late hours and so on. And I've talked to some of the students, and they say, no, it's a special place to me. I can go there and be quiet. I can go there and think deeper thoughts or say my prayers and so on. And that's become one of those special places to them. I don't know what other examples would be like that, but surely churches do function that way. Even if there isn't liturgy going on there, public, communal worship, still they have this character maybe of being special to us, or enabling us to think more deeply, or to sense something else important about life. Maslow's idea of going to the ocean brings in that whole idea of nature again. I mean, some people have their special places. I used to have in another campus a tree I like to go stand under. Now, trees have been important in religious experience throughout history. Interestingly enough, trees, mountains, and so on, they seem to be able to suggest something about God to us. There's many cultures that thought of mountains as being the place where God lived, up on the top of the mountain, Mount Olympus. It's where all of the gods lived. And it's sort of that upward movement opens up the sky to us, opens up the realm of transcendence to us. And maybe the tribe that carried the pole is the same way, in a sense. That pole not only rooted them, but it opened up to the transcendent,
beyond themselves, beyond the earth that they had their feet on.
Yes.
I'm thinking of a quote by John Muir, the great conservationist in this country 100 years ago, who spoke about the cathedrals of Yosemite Valley and spoke of them being more profound than any of the great cathedrals of Europe. For him, at least. It's a wonderful quotation.
So what we're seeing is that seems to be a human need to have special places, and then that sort of sets up this idea that, well, what the Christian people do is gather in a special place for their worship, and then I guess what we would like to see, that space organized and worked out in such a way that it enhances the worship, and especially helps us to worship in a way that is in accord with for us in the Catholic tradition, the Second Vatican Council and some of our liturgical reforms. I'm sure that suggests some ideas to you, Rob.
I guess I would like to emphasize first that the space itself is important, but not in that more pagan sense of it being this space over against some other space, but rather it's important because this is where the community is choosing to gather to celebrate its faith. That's what's key about it, is what they do there. And then the way that we prepare the space has everything to do with what we're doing there, not the other way around. So it's a much more active rather than static experience of the space.
I'm sure for you that's the key point, isn't it?
It's
because
terribly,
when you start to ask how you're going to reform liturgy or improve liturgy or what kind of sacred space you want to begin with that premise. This is where the community gathers to pray, to hear the Word, to share the sacred meal, and to root themselves again. We emphasis on the assembly then, right?
Very much
on the
so.
community of people.
And on the Lord who meets them when they gather as a whole people of faith. That is a key understanding in our renewal of Christian faith and life today, that we are the first of the sacraments, the very people of God, and then we celebrate sacraments that our high point rites, ways of giving explicit expression to what we believe about the way God is present to us and active in our lives and active in our world. So that the main point I love to characterize by the phrase that we have moved in our understanding of our worship from devout attendance to active participation, and the place itself, how we prepare it, has to facilitate that.
That's well said, Rob. Why don't you expand on that a little bit and tell me, how would our space begin to look then if that's what we're going to do, enhance the worship and our opportunity to meet the Lord?
I would say that our former experience, that what you and I experienced as children and all the people of our generation and beyond us, experienced church, perhaps we wouldn't have said it this way, but it's basically the experience of a stage on which the rites of the church were celebrated by the actors, the priest only at that point, and the servers helping him out a little bit, and a largely passive audience. There was, for all purposes, a stage with a proscenium arch on it and this great barrier between what we call the sanctuary and the nave. That is going, it is hardly gone yet, but it is, we're in a transition from that more static situation that was very correct and serviceable when we had an image of ourselves as worshipers in a mode of devout attendance. But now that we're moving to a sense that it is all of us who are the celebrants of the liturgy, we are all active participants, all the actors, now we're no longer in a stage audience situation, but the entire church becomes a place of active worship.
I take it that one of the main ways we've tried to symbolize the point that you're making is by putting the altar in such a position so that the celebrant, the priest, presider, can face all of the other celebrants, and
Yes.
We can create sort of an interaction situation. So we don't want people to the back of the priest. We'd
Yes.
like to have them in front, and we'd like to have a certain amount of eye contact among the people who have gathered to worship. So that'd be one of the main ways we've tried to implement your distinction there between devout attendance and active participation, which
Yes.
incidentally I like that as a nice code phrase for it. That's a good one.
Especially with the liturgy of the Word, the first part of the major Sunday worship of Roman Catholics, then we want to have direct eye contact, ideally between the one proclaiming the Word, whether layperson or priest proclaiming the gospel or deacon, with every other person there, because the Word is not simply words on a page, but the Word being proclaimed as a living event right at this moment, the living Word of God being proclaimed here and now, and being interpreted and mined for us, chewed over by all of us together.
So
it's
that
a
eye
terribly
contact
active
would be
idea
important, yeah.
that it's and ideally we should have all of our faces out of our missalettes or out of our books, so that we're not following sacred words on a page, but hearing the living Word of God proclaimed as an event of people in relationship with one another.
And that ought to help promote a sense of community,
Very
because
much
this is
so.
our common meeting with the Lord. It suggests our common value system, the things that hold us together, the sacred Word.
And that it is something unique and special happening now. It isn't simply old words being said, but it is old words that have great meaning and great force coming to life for us now, and coming to us as compassion or comfort and as challenge to us now. So that's, I think, what is all symbolized by the relationship of people with eye contact to one another. Then with the Eucharist, it can be that same situation, or even more the sense of everyone gathered around the holy table, ideally.
Does this mean that we need that movable chairs are a good thing to have instead of fixed pews?
There's a lot of discussion still around that. What's the ideal for that? The ideal, however you do it, and I've seen it done beautifully both with fixed pews or with at least pews that are able to be moved and with individual chairs, you want to have people in relationship not only with the action of the liturgy but with one another. That they're able to confront one another and see one another as the presence of the Lord among us. That is meant to go on. Quite different from seeing only the backs of heads, which we saw for many, many centuries in the church in the more static setup in our churches.
I think what you've presented there, Rob, is very important for people who are thinking about changing churches and so on. We all know there's high emotions over the renewal of church buildings, the changing of the furniture and the structure and so on. Many people feel very sensitive about all of that. And it would strike me that it's very important to keep the theology straight, to have a sort of large perspective, the kind that you've developed here, that would enable one to say, well, no, that we're not just changing this church because we want something to do, or it's some sort of faddish thing, but we're trying to live out a new understanding of what the church is, the whole people of God, the whole assembly, and we're hoping the way we arrange the space will help us to do that. And that would be an important thing for people to keep in mind who want to renovate churches, it would seem to me.
Yes, I'd like to move on to a little
if you're going to have to do it fairly briefly, but go ahead, you start. I'll stop you.
One of the challenges connected with this, and people complain all the time, they have their finger on it. Well, they say, our new churches seem so cold. They don't seem to have any sense of God's presence in them. I think we have to keep a balance here very well, maintaining a sense of this being a gathering for people, but not just any people. It's a group of believers. So there needs to be a sense of transcendence about the place still, but we don't do it anymore just with darkness and with huge spaces, but now finding other ways. And the document that has been written by our U.S. bishops talks about that being best brought about by a care with everything we use in that place, and a care with how the place is built, with an honesty in materials and with great care in the making of them, with good artistry. I think that's very important, that can be an opening to God also.
Rob, well said and succinctly said. I thank you very much. What we've tried to do is look at the whole question of space, the way it affects us psychologically, just in the culture as a whole, and then how that relates to our liturgy. And you have made the point that our space needs to be a place where the assembly gathers, where we can be with one another, and especially where we can still sense the powerful presence of God.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections was Reverend Rob Seidner, who is pastor of St. Charles Church in Lima, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was worship and space. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future topics, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.